Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. In today's episode, we're talking with Dr. Jennifer Thomas. She's the co-author, along with Dr. Gary Chapman, of the 5 Apology Languages, The Secret to Healthy Relationships. Dr. Thomas's work builds on the framework of the 5 love languages and offers a profound new lens for how we give and receive apologies. So if you've ever felt like you've said, "I'm sorry," but it just didn't quite land, or if you've been on the receiving end of an apology that didn't feel satisfying, this conversation is going to hit home. In this discussion, Dr. Thomas talks about how often an apology can go unheard or feel insincere, not because you don't mean it, but because you're not speaking the other person's apology language. Just like love, apologies are not one size fits all, and her work explores the psychology behind why some apologies fail to resonate, even when they are heartfelt. Through extensive research, she and her co-author, Dr. Gary Chapman, identified 5 distinct apology languages, each reflecting different emotional and cognitive needs that may need to be addressed for an apology to be effective. This episode is full of practical advice on how to express a heartfelt apology that truly communicates "I'm sorry" in a way that others can receive and feel. It will help you to recognize what you need. These tools and insights will provide a powerful path to restoring connection and healing relationships. And so we're so excited to share this conversation with you and really hope that it sparks some of the same deep insights that it did for us. And with that, we'll jump into our conversation with Dr. Jennifer Thomas. All right, Dr. Jennifer Thomas, thank you so much for being here with us. We've been so intrigued by your work and we're so excited to talk about this with you today. So thanks so much for being here and for your book.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my privilege to be able to be here and to sit with you and to speak to your audience.
Thank you. I think probably everybody listening has been affected by the 5 love languages with Dr. Gary Chapman, and he's your co-author for this book. And I feel like actually I had the same experience of just serious epiphany when I read this book. It just felt like this whole new world became visible that has been I've been blind to. And Tim and I have been married for 18 years, so this has sparked some really interesting conversations. And it really has blown my mind in the same way that love languages did. So could you just talk about how these 5 apology languages became clear to you, and also just how you connected with Dr. Chapman to begin with?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed psychologist in North Carolina, and I've been married for about 30 years. We have 3 kids, 2 of whom are now grown. And it was in the midst of some marriage struggles that I realized that JT wasn't accepting my apologies very well. He would still look frustrated, and I didn't want it to move to the point of there being contempt between us. We try to, keep short accounts and have things going smoothly. And so I would bring it up with him, like, well, you seem mad, and I said I was sorry. Probably a lot of people can relate to feeling like those magic words just aren't working anymore with that other person. And so I remember one night in particular where I had said I was sorry for something that it was a mistake I made, and I definitely own that. But the saying "I'm sorry," it was almost like I hadn't said it at all. And so I asked him about it, and he said, "Well, yeah, I just wish you would apologize." And I thought, well, I did apologize. And so I told him that, and I asked what he was waiting to hear. And he knew right away what he wanted. And I like to invite people to pause there and to think about, well, what do you think JT wanted to hear? Because your answer might reflect your own apology language. And in his case, he wanted me to say I was wrong. And so I said, okay, well, to me, they're kind of synonyms. So yeah, I was wrong too. And I was willing to say it. It just the same kind of idea, to be able to try to smooth over the problem and get the offense out of the way. To me, I'm sorry, and I was wrong, weren't that different. But to him, they are. And so I made a note about it. And as a psychologist, I've worked over the years to help people with forgiveness. And I knew that "I'm sorry" often isn't enough. And there were a couple of other things I had heard that people were often looking for in apologies. And so I set out to find out what were all the things, all those magic words that other people might be waiting for and that could be hindering their forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And so before too long, I got curious about whether Gary Chapman had ever thought about this idea, because, he wrote the 5 love languages, and there is that parallel where you're offering something, but if you aren't hitting the mark with them, you may check it off and move on and not realize that they were waiting for something else.
And they
Wow.
may not realize it either, which I think is what was the most interesting to me, that when it's your primary language, it feels like the water you're swimming in. So you may not even know how to articulate what you want because it seems obvious that it's the right thing, that it's the right way to apologize or it's the right way to express love. And I think that's what's so illuminating about this work and love language is that as soon as you have eyes to see it, all of a sudden you're able to absorb love and apologies in new ways that may literally just have been totally invisible.
You know, Aubrey, you're right. They're more complex than we think that they are. I say that apologies are like wallpaper. They're all around us, but we don't pay much attention to them. And I'm now frequently interviewed about the 5 apology languages. And a common question that people will start off with right out of the gate is, what is the best way to apologize?
Hmm.
And my answer is, actually, I can't answer that. It would be as if you asked me, what's the best way to show love or appreciation? And the answer is, of course, it depends. And so what I'm trying to do, and what my co-author Gary Chapman is trying to do, is to help people become multilingual in their apologies. So I looked him up and I said, I just really see a strong parallel between these two ideas. And I want to know if you've ever thought about this. And he said, honestly, I never have, but I really think that this could have some legs to it. I think people are really stuck in their unforgiveness. And what we know is whenever we live and breathe, we're going to offend people. And what we see with that is that the offenses are like bricks in a wall. And so now we've got these walls built up between us and other people. And he said, I think people are desperate for help with this. Let's do some research on it. And so we polled his readers about what are you waiting to see in an apology. And what we found was that there were 5 different things. I promise we weren't looking for 5, although we know he likes that number. And so now we both, when we speak about the love languages, we also speak about the apology languages, because what we say is that the two taken together are the 2 essentials for healthy relationships. If you want to keep your love tank full, you've got to be able to apologize in a way that's really going to land with the other person. And we want to be able to share both concepts. And I'm always curious about how have you, as the interviewer, heard about the 5 apology languages? May I ask that question?
Yes, I'll tell you, about 3 weeks ago, I was asked to teach a lesson to the women in our congregation about saying I'm sorry. And I was feeling anxious about it because I know that I have a really hard time with this. And so I started reading books, and I literally read the book in the week before this lesson, and it just completely blew my mind. And it explained, I think, a lot of the conflicts that I have felt internally and interpersonally about apologizing. And so it became our Sunday lesson was about apologizing and through the 5 languages. And then I've shared it with everyone, and it's been such interesting conversation within my own family of origin, and then also, of course, with Tim. I think it resonates immediately. As soon as you hear it once, you almost don't even have to read the book. You hear it, and then you realize everything starts making sense and clicks into place because you have this new lens. So it's been really interesting to talk about inside our family, but also with our neighbors and our congregation. So that's how I found it, and then I gave it to Tim.
Yeah, that's great. And I do find, Aubrey, that a lot of people are giving it to their spouses. They ask me, can I put it on their pillow? For some people to apologize, it's really hard because it strikes it at their sense of pride and worth. And it takes humility to be willing to offer a sincere apology. And so I thank you for shining a light on this topic today.
Jennifer, would you mind running through quickly what the 5 apology languages are, just so listeners have context of what we talk about as we move through the rest of the conversation?
Yes, I will. And as I do these, I'm going to use the framework of past, present, and future. This isn't actually in the 5 apology languages book, but I have found that it helps people to be able to remember them. So the first 2 are talking about the past. So they are saying I'm sorry, letting them know that you understand emotionally that the damage that you have done has exacted a price for them. So it's getting at the heart and at their feelings. And you want to be specific with all of these to let them know that it hurts you, that you've caused them hurt or frustration or disappointment. And then the second one is similar, and it's what JT wanted. That is saying, I was wrong. So again, we're talking about the offense in the past, but here I think of it more as the mind, where you're focusing on, okay, in an objective sense, if I were in a court of law, I'm now pleading guilty. And so you're not going to defend yourself. You're not going to try to blame others. You're going to be specific. I tell people, don't say, I was wrong in what I did. You need to name exactly what you did or failed to do that you were wrong about. And then the third apology language is moving to the present. And that is, how can I make you whole again? How can I make this right? And so we call it making amends. And this is one of the AA 12 steps, of course, where, when people have struggled with an addiction, they are admonished to go and to make things right with the people who they've hurt. Because we know that disappointments don't just go away with the passing of time, but in order to really be restored to other people, we need to go and fix things. Yeah. And then the last two apology languages are moving towards the future. So our fourth one is preventing a reoccurrence of the problem. So with this, you need to let them know how you're going to change or what new plan you're going to put into place in order to prevent the problem from happening. This is my second favorite apology language. And I find as I talk to office managers, because I do a lot of consulting now, that this one resonates with them, because we may be feeling forgiving like the first or the second time that you make a mistake. But if you're managing people, and this could be your family as well, and they keep doing the same thing, you realize you're running out of patience and they actually need to put changes into place. And so you want to hear from them, well, what's going to be different next time around? And as I've gone, you may have noticed that these 5 build on each other. And so you could see them as steps to a complete apology, or you can treat them as separate apology languages, whichever you prefer. And our final apology language is the one that we found only about 3% of people have this, but they really want to hear it. And that is the question, will you please forgive me? So all of us have scripts for what makes an acceptable apology. And if your parents or your teachers expected you to ask that, then you grow up, you go to work, you apologize to your boss, or you're in a relationship, you apologize to your partner. And they may feel like you were just getting warmed up to a really good apology, but you stopped short. And why was that? And this group, I've had them come up to me after I speak, and they'll say with some emotion, honestly, I've always feared I was an unforgiving person. But what I'm now learning is that I just wanted to hear something in an apology that most people were not taught to ask me.
Wow.
And so that's our work, is to help people become bilingual or trilingual in their apologies as they work with others to remove those obstacles and the barriers that come with our mistakes.
Does your research have anything to say about why people speak the native apology language that they speak? Is it family cultures, or other genetics, or what factors sort of dictate why I am the way that I am when it comes to apologies?
Well, it's a great question. It's one that I love, Tim, as a researcher. And my training was in both clinical and community psychology. And community focuses a lot on our cultures. And we haven't done an intensive study yet of cultures around this, but what we're seeing is that there is a tendency towards being more indirect with certain cultures. And so you wouldn't go and demand an apology from someone in that culture. And so that changes the whole dynamic. But what we have found is that we're all taught some way of apologizing, even though it may vary by culture. And so it's environmental, it's teaching from the people around us. Basically, when we do something wrong, we get put in the doghouse. And an apology is the key that we learn that will get us out of the doghouse. And so whatever worked for our parents or the people who were over us when we were a child, that's the same key that we're going to keep trying to use. But what I'm really trying to help with is where people get stuck because, again, they had different models. Another one that I'll sometimes run into is maybe a couple where her parents accepted "I'm sorry," which obviously my parents accepted that. But then you're with a partner where maybe JT's parents didn't accept that. And he may even have scripts in his head from them like, well, "I'm sorry" isn't enough. And so guess what? When I say "I'm sorry" to him repeatedly, he shoots that back at me. And as you and your listeners can think about, that feels rough because I said the magic words and it got them thrown back at me. But to him, that's just an ingrained response to an inadequate apology. And so we do need to do just what you've done, Aubrey and Tim, which is to sit down with our families. And also our work teams are like families. They're big old family systems. And so I work with groups to help the whole staff take the apology language test, which is available for free online, just like the love languages test is. We want to help people be able to get their results and share them with others.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting to just see it in black and white, that this is just that you could be opposites with the people who are closest to you, and it makes things make sense. But can we talk about kids for a minute? Because this was almost my immediate question after finishing the book, that, how do you teach kids to apologize in a way that will really set them up for healthy relationships later? Because especially younger kids, it's very easy to just demand that they say the words. And sometimes it feels like, they're still feeling angry and they don't want to apologize, and it doesn't ever feel sincere. But is there any use for like training that in even if it isn't sincere, just like getting them in the habit of recognizing when they've done something wrong? Because it feels like what usually comes out of our 6-year-old's mouth would not be a sincere and useful apology as an adult, but it feels like she's got to start somewhere, right? So how do you teach young kids what an effective and sincere apology looks like?
Yeah, this is a tough question because often when we make kids apologize, they're not sad that they did it. They're sorry that they're in trouble, or they're sorry that you're mad. And it's a high tension time when they're in the wrong and you're in the right. So I think one of the best ways to teach it is by modeling it. And to let them watch you handle situations where you owe an apology, whether it's to them or to someone else that's around you. They can pick up the languages that way. It is very important for them to learn all 5 of them. Another tip that we can teach them is, I found that a really good lead-in for apologies is the phrase, "I apologize." It's not in and of itself a separate language, but it lets the other person know that you want to accept responsibility and that you're not going to get defensive on them, and to stay tuned because an important apology is coming down the pike. So I find that it's disarming in a helpful way where people can kind of put down their weapons and be ready to talk with us when we're ready to try to make things right with them. And I'll tell you a bit more about what I did with my own kids. I tried using sign language for them back when they were babies, and I see that as a growing trend. And so one of the first things I asked a friend was, "What's the sign for I'm sorry?" And she told me that it's your fist with your thumb on top going in a circle. Guess where? Around your heart. Yes. And so that was helpful for us because I could teach them, even if they weren't willing to say the words, "I apologize," I could say, or if they weren't willing to say, "I'm sorry." I mean, at that age, they aren't going to use the word apologize. We could do that even if they didn't feel ready to use the words. Another thing is, I didn't demand that they speak the words of the apology. I would say, you can either say it to the person who you've offended, often me, but it could have been a sibling too, or you can write it. And so that is a little bit of a way to let them save face, where they can put down the words and then they would slide it under their door sometimes, which always made me laugh. So, they really didn't want to see me, but they would And if I was in my room with the door shut, they would slide it under my door and I would go get it. And I got some really terrible apologies from them because they're still mad. Like I remember one that I kept from my son when he was, I don't know, maybe 7. He said, he wrote, "I apologize for having said that you're stupid, but you should know that people don't mean everything they say." And so, even at that age, they're twisting it and blaming the victim in a sense. But I allowed that to be enough because it was, it's in parenting, it's successive approximations, not controlling every single interaction. And he was moving in the right direction and hopefully got a little better each time around.
Yeah. So as I've been thinking about this and its implications in my own life, I've wondered a lot about the sort of inverse side of this, which is not, asking apologies, but forgiveness. And obviously, I know you come up from a religious background as well. I think the Bible and the scriptures have more to say possibly about forgiveness than they do about apologizing. And I'm wondering, and I guess as I've sort of like looked inside myself, I've realized that I have something of a value, whether or not that's appropriate, around being the type of person that doesn't require apologies in order to forgive. I feel like it's sort of like my responsibility to forgive regardless of the actions of the other person. And I'm just curious if that's come up for you and how you think about it. When, like, in a relationship, should an apology be required? If and just to be clear, I'm not perfect at that by any means. Like, I have absolutely held grudges and withheld forgiveness. But I have felt like the right thing to do, at least, would be to forgive regardless. And so how do you think about that side of things? And do you see it as, in order for a relationship to be whole and healed again, is an apology always required?
Yeah, this is a huge question. And it's one where I think a lot of people feel that they know the answer based on scripture. And yet we're actually ruffling some feathers and saying, wait a minute, let's look back at what the scriptures actually say. So here are a couple of pages of literature review that I did on scriptures about forgiveness in the Bible. And you're right, there's not a lot on apologies in here. I would go to Proverbs, a few other places where it can point in that direction. But some of the interesting things that we found in there showed Gary Chapman, and then he pointed out to me that often we're lumping two concepts together under the heading of forgiveness. And the concept that we may have lost touch with is called forbearance. And that is the theological term for one-sided or one-way forgiveness when a person is not repenting. And so we devoted part of a chapter to this. And we have a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer that talks about cheap grace. And cheap grace is the forgiving of people who haven't repented, basically. And so we're now inviting people to go back to their scriptures and dig around and to see where we're admonished, like, you have to forgive or you won't be forgiven. Which model are they talking about? You have to forgive repentant people, unrepentant people, or both? And we have not found an example where people were admonished to forgive someone who was unrepentant. What we've seen is that it was assumed or previously stated that the person was repentant, and then we needed to forgive them, just as God forgives us. And so, people often have questions. It is something that can shake up what you've been thinking. I'll tell you another one people bring up is like Jesus on the cross saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Yes.
Was he forgiving them? Well, he was forbearing. And forbearing literally means releasing the other person to God for judgment. And it's so important that we do that, just as you're doing, Tim, where we don't allow hate to live in our heart, and where we're praying for the other person, that they would not keep hurting us, not hurt others, that they would change. But I invite everyone to learn this important concept, because what's the danger? the danger, if we don't know the difference, is that we might pressure victims to forgive people who have hurt them when things haven't changed. It's still happening. And then I would worry that I would become part of the problem. And I know that's the last thing that any of us as helpers want to do.
That's so interesting. I think we definitely use forgiveness for both of those. We
Uh-huh.
just use it. We use it to mean everything. But I like the concept that either way you always have the agency to sort of release yourself from the just like the heaviness of being in conflict with someone. But that's what you're saying, right? Like even in a forbearance situation, you can offer that and let it go regardless of an apology. Like maybe it's you have, of course, boundaries or and maybe even still feelings, but it seems like there can still be this sense of not having to carry the conflict in the way that it feels like it's very alive when you're still in the middle of it.
That's
Is that
right.
right?
If you can release them to God, then you're not carrying the weight of it. You're letting God
Yeah.
carry the weight of it. And we talk about, I hope people will change, but I'm not going to be, their God who changes their heart. I can just pray that God will do that. And so as that person comes to our mind, we can release them and lift them up in prayer. And that's so important. And I want to speak to the person who's listening today and they have an unapologized for hurt that they're carrying. I've been through several of these situations. In my case, it's often friendships of women. Look out. Because those things have gone south for me 2 or 3 times. And it just completely knocks me off of my feet when it happens, because it's often unexpected and it's very distracting. I think if you've been through this and your listeners can relate, it's so hard to get out of your head. And I'm guilty of this too, of letting someone live rent free in my brain. And I'm working on some more material about how we can get free of that and be able to tune in and focus on improving those relationships where possible, and then focusing on the other people who are around and connecting with them in ways that really matter.
So that's so interesting. And if we could maybe just drill down a tiny bit more on this concept of forgiveness versus forbearance, I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Sure.
So obviously they're similar in that in both cases we've released the negativity and I guess the feeling that we're the ones who are required to judge the other person. What are the practical differences? Like what different steps have I actually taken if I'm forgiving versus I'm forbearing? Is it in the case of forbearance that that I still have closed off some vulnerability and that I haven't fully opened up trust to this person again, whereas I have with forgiveness? Or how would you differentiate those
Right.
two?
Yeah. They're on a spectrum, I would say. So forbearance is the first step, and that's where you're willing to release them to God, but they have not repented or apologized. Then forgiveness is in the middle, where forgiveness is a two-way transaction. If you think about it like in the financial world, if I'm going to forgive your debt, I'm going to say that it's no longer held against you. And emotionally speaking, it's usually that I'm going to pay the debt. And it's not a third party. I, as the victim, am going to incur your debt, and I'm going to agree not to throw it up in your face. And that's what the scriptures say about forgiveness, that you should no longer remember it no more. And I studied that because I was wondering, is that like a Hallmark thing, or is that really in scripture? Well, it's really in scripture. Remember it no more. But if you go back to the original Greek and Hebrew, the word remember means speaking. So what you're promising to do when you forgive someone is to wipe away that debt you carry it yourself by not speaking it, not throwing it up in their face.
Oh, wow.
But we can have some very guilty feeling people because it's still, again, living in our brain. But we don't need to feel in any way, spiritually defective because we can't forget it, because that's not what we're called to do. We're called in forgiveness to allow that transaction to go through, that they repent or apologize. And so we've moved from forbearance to forgiveness in the middle. Then over here are things like rebuilding trust and reconciling.
Okay.
And Tim, that's what you were getting at, which I think is a great question. Where do those fit? Those really come after we figure out Okay, am I going to accept their apology? What's that going to look like? Then going forward, are we going to be in relationship together or not? And that is a whole different question, because you can apologize, I can forgive you, and we can still say, but we're not good for each other. Here, I personally draw a bit of a distinction between friends and family, or dating and family.
Mm.
It makes me so sad when family members can't talk to each other. And so we may shift and talk some about that, because I know our current political environment is not helping families. But if it's a family member, I double down, triple down on trying to get a passable road of communication restored between them and the other person.
That makes so much sense. And that is where I wanted to go next. I'm just wondering, is there a time when an apology is not necessarily useful? And maybe it's a relationship that is destructive anyway, but also just, I think I think especially women may be socialized to sort of have this reflexive apology
Oh, yeah.
orientation in a relationship. And that feels so different than what you describe in the whole book. Like this, I felt like these apology languages are about showing up in a relationship with your healthiest, wisest, wholest self, and genuinely trying to fix something that you regret. And I feel like there's this other experience that I very often have, which is like a quick, I have a guilty orientation to my life. And that feels like a totally different headspace. So
Yeah.
can you talk about just like when is an apology important, and how do you tell the difference between this reflex that might be out of fear and something that feels more whole and healthy?
Yeah, such an important question. As I work with corporate women, I talk to them about the problem of over apologizing, especially.
Okay.
And we do have a section on that let me show the title, in the 5 apology languages. We go into this. Now, women are not the only over apologizers. Men can do it as well. It's really anyone who's conflict avoidant. And these these are often our people pleasers. And I include myself in that, the people who don't want anyone to be mad at us. And so we quickly try to sweep the problem under the rug, and we're willing to take the fall in terms of offering an apology that may not even be ours to give. And so here's a question that I sometimes get asked, and that is, should you apologize even if you don't think you did anything wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And our answer is no. Sorry, all apologies need to be sincere. And so if you're feeling that urge, I would say resist it, because what's going to happen is you're going to offer the apology, and the dynamic may keep going, and then you're going to be mad because nothing changed, and here I apologize and it's still a mess. And so you're going to be resentful eventually of kind of swallowing all of that. It's like you're a trash can and you're putting the junk in, you're eating it instead of helping the group to deal with it. So I would advise someone in that situation to tolerate the awkwardness and to have a conversation about what's wrong, what is needed, and try to use your reflective listening. Of course, as a psychologist, I'm big on that. So hear people out, and instead of then taking your side, repeat what they said on their side and say something like, okay, so as you see it, this is where things went wrong, and you really think that I could have handled it better, or should have done something differently. And then they could say yes or no. And then instead of apologizing at that point, if you really don't think you did anything wrong, something that can help the conversation to move forward, this is a tip, is to use the phrase wish. I wish I could take it back. I wish I could get this out from being a problem between the two of us. You could even say, I wish I had done things differently, if that's true. Like maybe given where you are now and given what they said, you do wish you could have used a different word that didn't set them off or something. But I find people feel apologized to, and yet you can still be true to your principles, which are, I only offer sincere apologies.
It's interesting. Oh, sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, I can't remember who talks about they call it the holy work of staying out of resentment. But I think about that all the time. And it does feel like when I frame it that way, it doesn't feel frivolous. It feels like really important work to that, like inner work to decide, is this something that I feel genuine remorse and or guilt for, and I want to have that conversation, or is this about there's conflict here, and it's not necessarily that an apology is required, but something is required, like some kind of exploration is like nagging at me. So it feels like resentment is the consequence of flippant apologies. So I'm totally on board, but it's so uncomfortable.
Yes, well said. I resonated with all of what you said there. And it can be really difficult to sort that out, but I think we need to be true to ourselves. And, ultimately, the question that we're going to have when we receive apologies is, was it sincere? And so we need to be checking ourselves before we offer them to say, is this going to be sincere? Or do we just need to talk with the person about the problem and see what it would take from each side for us to get to a better place?
And it makes me wonder though, if if it's on us in many cases, in order to become sincere, to just understand more deeply like how we really were part of the problem. I remember I'm going to get this story a little bit mixed up, I think, but in the book, there was a man who had some kind of stock tip, I think, or something like that, and maybe invested and didn't share it with his brother. And his brother, am I totally slaughtering this? And
Yeah, go
I remember
ahead.
that.
okay, and the
Yeah.
brother was upset, and he felt like he hadn't done anything wrong, like he didn't feel a responsibility to have shared this with his brother, but eventually, because his brother was offended, he realized that he needed to apologize. And so
Right.
like it's a tricky situation where it's like, do I need to apologize if something is objectively wrong, or do I need to apologize if someone has been offended, regardless
Right.
of how morally upright I may have seen my actions being? Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
And as I recall that story, the split between the brothers went on for decades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those things affect our children and their children. And it gets to the place where it's like, okay, we're just going to have to find a bridge between us that we can walk across, even if they aren't our favorite person. Again, it's family, and we want to find a way to resolve this. But you raise an important question, Tim. What about when there's not a clear fault? They're mad. But at the same time, I don't share every single thing with my brother. So was I at fault not to do that?
Mhm.
And I would just suggest that same tool about, is there a place for the phrase, I wish? Like maybe that's an olive branch to say, oh man, I really wish I had shared with you what I was reading about then. And that could have made such a difference and then I would go into your commitment to the other person and talk about, it's been so hard not to see you, and I really care about you.
Yeah.
And that's a path of rebuilding.
Yeah, definitely. Really quickly before we move on from the languages, I just wanted to ask you one more thing about the words I apologize or I'm sorry, because I are you seeing that sort of a precursor to whatever the language is? Like, does it need to start with I'm sorry and then whatever, however you are apologizing? Because I think like for me, revising the plan, making a plan for change is very high on my list, but I recognize that that's probably completely invisible to whoever I've hurt. And it feels to me like the ultimate act of sincerity. Like I'm gonna change who I am so this doesn't happen again. But I
Right.
also can see how that could fly under the radar for years, you know? And
Mhm.
so do the words I apologize and I'm sorry, is that a given that it starts there before anything else happens?
Good question. Just a tip I have is that a good lead in is the phrase, I apologize.
Okay.
And that one is not a separate apology language. It's just setting the stage for the apology that will come.
Okay. That totally makes sense.
Okay,
Um,
great.
can we talk about groups? And when you're we've done a lot of we've talked a lot about just personal relationships and one-on-one apologies, but how do these dynamics change if it's a group that is apologizing or if you're apologizing to a group? Is this a different conversation?
We would say that the same principles apply. So the nice thing is that it can work in a group. And I'm working with a nonpartisan political group right now called Braver Angels. Their website is braverangels.org. And what we're doing is a national charity that I've I've joined on, and we're trying to bring civility to political discourse. And we're trying to stop people from maligning the other side and talking about good people and evil people. And so that's an example of a group situation where people have been very hurt and offended and feel very threatened. Anxiety is high right now around our country, and I would say around the world as well. And so I want to be a peacemaking force in my life with the people in my circle, and also, the groups with whom I share this concept. So how can we find our way to peace when we are a part of a whole group that has been offended? And the other side, the challenge is that they may not feel that they did anything wrong. In fact, guess what they have? They have their own list of offenses. And so the challenge in those cases, I think, is to find what common ground we have and to begin there, to not set out contradicting them and arguing from our heads, but beginning first with what can we agree about. And so examples would be, I agree, we want a safe place in which to raise our children. I agree, love is one of the most important values that we can have. I agree that there shouldn't be violence, like gun violence against other people. We need to feel safe, and that's a key value. And so once we show those commonalities, often the other side may see how we're not completely different from them, but we have shared ground. So that's really an important step and lays the groundwork for being able to hear each other better, is just to create a little island of understanding, a little bit of land that both sides can stand on while we try to work through the issues that are dividing us.
Yeah. I'm curious how you see institutional apologies, and if you think it might benefit them to be more explicit about apologies when a large segment of membership feels that one is merited.
Yeah, it's an important question. I'm reminded of certain parenting styles, I would say more on the authoritarian side, where that parent might not ever apologize to their child. And it's systemically, it's the same concept of, I need to be the authority unquestioned up here. And if I'm going to humble myself and admit a mistake, then how can I be up on my pedestal? And what I would advise that person or that group is to consider that we actually respect people more when they can admit their mistakes or the mistakes of their predecessors. If you think about maybe a mentor in your life, someone who you respected enormously, think about, would that person apologize when they needed to? And chances are that the answer is yes.
Thank you. I had one more thing I'd love to ask you, which is just that it feels like there's this opportunity to sort of explain when something has gone wrong and you really do genuinely want to apologize. I know there's very often this impulse to explain what happened, but there's this fine line between explaining and justifying or blaming or excusing, and of course that would make an apology much less sincere. But so can you talk about the difference, and is there some is it important to walk through that, because I can imagine how without any sort of an explanation, whatever happened could feel thoughtless or flippant, or and maybe could even be more hurtful. But it's clear to me that trying to excuse yourself for whatever happened could really damage how effective and sincere the apology feels. So do you see a difference between those two? Is there a place for explaining what happened, like what went wrong, and institutionally or in a personal relationship?
Yeah, Aubrey, I'm glad that you asked this. It is an important question. And I will say I'm not the only person going around and talking about apologies. There have been a few other books that have been released since ours was. And we don't all agree on the steps to a complete apology and what everyone needs to hear. And there is one other book out there where explaining is actually part of the steps of the apology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I think they ended up with 5 steps as well. And And so I've been thinking about this, and actually I responded to a reader recently who asked me the same question. And my response is, the trouble with explaining is, just as you said, it can sound like an excuse. And yet, if I were to talk to this other expert who has this perspective, I would come in peace and say, I can appreciate what you're saying there, because in my own life, I've seen times where the explanation was helpful. If we're talking about attributions and the stories we tell ourselves in our heads, sometimes people's stories are going to be less negative if they understand our explanation. So I do want to give that credit its due. But what we say is to try to separate the two in time. So the apology and the explanation, they don't play well together. And so I suggest leaving 15 minutes, an hour, maybe depending on the size of the offense, before coming back to it. And I'm going to give you another phrase that I like, and that is, I want to circle back. Sometimes it can be hard to bring up an awkward topic, but this is a really good way, as you're talking with someone either at home or at work, say, I want to circle back to something that's still been on my mind or that didn't sit well with me. And in this case, I could say, I want to circle back. I offered that apology for the mistake I made, and that completely stands. And yet there was something going on with me at the time that I realized it might be helpful for us to talk about. And I'd like to explain it to you if that's okay. And then wait and see if they say yes. And that might work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. This has been really awesome. Is there anything you wish that we would have asked or that you'd like to add?
I think you really covered things well. I thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk to people about how to offer an apology that's going to be received so we don't miss it with each other.
Yeah.
And I would just encourage your listeners to, when you think about the 5 love languages, and people are always giving that as a wedding gift. And I think that's fabulous. I want people to do that even more. But also think about, this couple's going to need to be able to handle some conflict. If they haven't had a fight yet, they certainly will on their wedding day. So they need to have the 5 apology languages in their back pocket as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, thank you. Your research here is remarkable, and like Aubrey said, it is so similar to the 5 love languages in that it's just so clear once you read it. It's so obvious that this
Right,
is
like,
this is
why
the
didn't I
truth.
think of that?
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, and it's so practical. So thank you again, and thanks for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Jennifer Thomas. You can find her book, The 5 Apology Languages, on Amazon, or go to 5lovelanguages.com to take the quiz and learn more about your own apology language. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.